The sky over Leicester that morning couldn't decide what it wanted to do. It hung low and undecided, not quite raining, not quite not. The kind of pale gray that makes everything feel suspended, like the city itself was holding its breath. Catherine had been awake since 5. Not the anxious kind of awake, where the ceiling becomes an enemy and thoughts spiral into lists. This was quieter than that. She'd sat in the small hours with a cup of tea gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, but feeling the shape of the day pressing in before it had even started. Leicester meant something. It always had, but not the way the schedules and briefing notes described it. Not the community visits, the voluntary programs, the carefully arranged itinerary where every handshake had a purpose and every smile was, in its own way, a kind of work. That part she understood. That part she was good at. It was the other thing. The thing no briefing note ever mentioned. She and William had been in the same room 100 times. 1,000, probably. And somewhere in the accumulated years of it, they had built a language that didn't use words. A glance that meant, "Are you all right?" A slight turn of the shoulder that meant, "I've got you." The almost imperceptible exhale before they stepped out of a car together that said, simply, "Here we go." Most people never saw it. That was the point, in a way. You spend enough time living your life as a kind of public document, every expression noted, every gesture cropped and captioned and debated, and you learn, almost by instinct, to keep the real things small, to compress them down to the size of a look, a fraction of a second, a nod. She dressed carefully. Not the way the papers would later describe it, the analysts who'd pore over every stitch of the outfit for coded messages, but carefully in the way of a woman who understands that how you present yourself is also a form of communication. That clothes carry weight. That on certain days in certain cities, you do not dress only for yourself. Leicester had been grieving, not loudly, not in the way that demands attention, but the kind of community grief that settles in slowly, in the spaces between things, in the quiet of a food bank volunteer who doesn't make eye contact at first, in the way a school teacher says it's been a hard year for the kids without finishing the sentence. Catherine had read the notes. Yes, but she'd also just known. The way she always knew when a place was carrying something it hadn't finished carrying yet. William found her in the corridor outside the briefing room. She heard him before she saw him. That particular pace, and the slight echo of it on polished floors, and something in her shoulders dropped 1/2 inch. A small thing. Involuntary. "You slept," he said. It wasn't a question. "A bit," she said, which was not quite a lie. He studied her face the way he always did, not intrusively, just long enough to do the translation, and then he nodded once. Small, almost nothing. That nod. It would have meant nothing to anyone watching, just a man acknowledging his wife in a corridor before a busy day. But Catherine felt it land somewhere specific, in the part of her that was tired in ways that didn't show. And she thought, not for the first time, that the whole of their marriage might be built out of exactly this. Tiny transmissions. A private frequency no one else could tune to. "Ready?" he said. She picked up her bag. "Yes," she said. And they walked out into the gray morning together. The motorcade moved through Leicester's streets, and Catherine watched the city through the window. Her shop fronts. A woman pushing a pram who didn't look up. A group of school kids in yellow high-vis vests who did, their faces a burst of unguarded delight, arms going up, phones coming out. She smiled at them through the glass. A real one. The kind that starts in the eyes before the face catches up. William was looking at his phone. Briefing notes, probably. Or a message from one of the children. She didn't look. She was thinking about what a grief counselor had told her once. During a visit to a hospice in Wales. A small woman with paint-stained hands who'd said, very quietly, that the hardest part of supporting people through pain wasn't knowing what to say. It was learning to just be present without filling the space. Catherine had thought about that sentence for 3 years. She thought about it now. Leicester needed presence, not performance. And that was perhaps the one thing she knew how to give without anyone having to ask. See, the community center smelled like instant coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, and, underneath both, something that smelled like effort. Catherine noticed that immediately. The kind of place that doesn't have a budget for anything that isn't necessary. But the walls had children's drawings pinned up in careful rows, and the folding tables had little posies of supermarket flowers in plastic cups, and someone had written "Welcome" on a whiteboard in 3 different colors and underlined it twice. And that underline, it got her every time. She moved through the room the way she'd learned to, not as a sweep, not as a procession, but slowly, genuinely, the kind of movement that says, "I'm not trying to get to the end of you." She stopped. She listened. She asked the kind of questions that don't have easy answers. What's been the hardest part, and what do you need that you haven't been able to say out loud yet? And then she waited, which was the harder thing. The thing most people in her position couldn't do. A woman named Sandra, 60-something, wearing a volunteer lanyard and sensible shoes, took Catherine's hands in both of hers and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "We didn't expect you to really come." Catherine looked at her. "Where else would I be?" Sandra laughed, a complicated kind of laugh, the sort that lives right next to crying. She squeezed Catherine's hands once more and let go. William was across the room. That Catherine didn't look directly at him. They'd learned not to years ago, learned that looking at each other in public could be misread, could be made into something it wasn't by people with very long lenses and very strong opinions. But she was aware of him the way you're aware of a window in a room, peripheral, constant, the light coming from a particular direction. He was crouched down, talking to a teenage boy who clearly hadn't wanted to be there and was now, very clearly, not quite managing to maintain the impression of not caring. The boy had his arms crossed. William was saying something Catherine couldn't hear. Then the boy laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that embarrasses you a moment after it escapes, and looked away. Catherine looked down at her own hands. There it is, she thought. There's the thing no briefing note accounts for. A woman from the hospice support team was waiting to speak with her next. Catherine turned to her fully, and for the next 20 minutes the rest of the room ceased to exist. That was the other thing she'd learned. That presence wasn't a constant state. You had to rebuild it, moment to moment. You could have 100% of yourself in a conversation and then step out of it and have nothing left. And then someone else would step forward and the whole thing would refill somehow. She didn't entirely understand the mechanism. She just knew it worked, and that it was real, and that the people she spoke to could always tell the difference between a person who was actually there and a person who was performing being there. The difference mattered. It was the only thing that mattered, probably. She was mid-conversation, a young social worker, eyes too tired for his age, talking about caseloads in a way that was technically professional and emotionally desperate, when she felt it. A shift in the room's atmosphere. Minor, directional. She glanced up. William was watching her. Not the watching of a man monitoring a situation. Not managerial, not protective, not the studied attentiveness of someone doing their public job. Just watching her. The way you watch something you find quietly remarkable. Like he'd looked over and seen something he wanted to remember. Their eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He gave her the nod. The same one from the corridor. Small. Almost nothing. But this time it carried more. This time it said, "I see what you're doing." It said, "I see who you are in this room, right now, with these people." It said something that 22 years of shared mornings and difficult years and 3 children and 1,000 public corridors had compressed down to a single small motion of his head. She felt it in her chest. Not a dramatic feeling. Not the kind that makes you press your hand to your sternum or take a breath. Just a quiet one. A settling. She turned back to the young social worker. "Tell me more about the caseloads," she said. And he did. The cameras were there, of course. They were always there. Long lenses, good ones, trained on faces and hands and the geography of every interaction. The photographers were professionals doing their jobs well, and their jobs were to capture. They got a lot. They got Sandra's hands holding Catherine's. They got the teenage boy laughing. And they got William crouching and Catherine standing, and both of them separately, and both of them together, and the room full of folding tables and supermarket flowers, and the whiteboard with the underlined "Welcome." What they didn't get, what they couldn't get because it happened in the space between a glance and a look, was the nod. 2 seconds. A private frequency. Already gone. The rain finally decided. It came as they were leaving, not dramatically, not in sheets, but in the steady, committed way of English rain that has made up its mind and will not be argued with. The kind that makes the pavements go dark, and the air smell like wet stone and something older underneath, something the city had been keeping. Catherine stood under the canopy at the entrance for a moment. Behind her, the sound of the community center, voices, the scrape of chairs, the particular busy hum of a place that had briefly held something significant and was now returning to itself. She could hear Sandra somewhere, laughing with a colleague, the teenage boy's voice, higher than she'd expected, saying something she couldn't make out. She exhaled. A long one, the kind that takes its time. William appeared at her shoulder, not crowding her, just there. The way he'd been there for more of her life than not. "Good," he said quietly. One word, not a judgment, more like confirmation. She said. They watched the rain together for a moment. The car was waiting, and the schedule continued. Another engagement, another city, probably. Another room full of people doing their best in circumstances that asked too much of them. That was the shape of the days. That had always been the shape of the days. "Sandra," Catherine said. She was... "I know," William said. She looked at him. He was watching the rain, not her, but his expression had the quality of a person who has been paying very close attention. "Did you hear her?" "No. But I could see her face when she let go of your hands." He paused. "I could see yours." Catherine looked back at the rain. She thought about what her face must have shown, in that moment that she hadn't known it was showing. She thought about the specific education of being with someone long enough that your involuntary expressions became readable to them, that you could no longer keep the private things private, not entirely, not from the one person who'd been in the room for all of them. And she thought about whether that was frightening or the opposite. "The boy," she said, "did you—" "Year 11. Mum left in September. He's been with his nan." William's jaw moved slightly. "Good kid." "Yes," Catherine said. That was all. They didn't add to it. Some things didn't need adding to. They just needed to be acknowledged, named, and then held quietly between two people who understood. The rain on the canopy above them made a sound like low applause. The car, when they got into it, he was warm. Catherine leaned her head back and closed her eyes for a moment. Not sleeping. Just the small luxury of not holding her face in any particular shape. Of being in a space where she didn't have to be anything for anyone for 30 consecutive minutes. She heard William typing on his phone. She heard the wipers. The city passed on the other side of the glass. "The nod," she said, eyes still closed. A pause. "In there. And when I was talking to the social worker." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I saw you." He didn't look up from his phone immediately, but she saw the corner of his mouth move, a small thing, private. It was nothing, he said. It wasn't nothing. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face she recognized. The thing that lived behind the competence and the public steadiness and the years of learning how to be impressive in rooms. Something much simpler than all of that. Just a person looking at a person they loved. You were... He stopped. Tried again. There's something you do when you're really listening. You go very still. Your whole face changes. He shrugged slightly. I noticed. Catherine held his gaze for a moment. You always notice, she said. Yes. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The rain ran down the windows in long silver threads. Leicester fell away behind them, its gray sky, its underlined welcome. In its Sandra and its tired social worker and its boy in year 11 who was living with his nan now and trying very hard to seem like it didn't matter. All of it carried with them, neither of them having to say so. Later, when the photographs from the visit circulated, the warm ones, the real ones, the kind that make people pause mid-scroll and feel something they can't immediately name, someone would write a caption about the natural ease between them, and about the quiet strength of a couple so clearly aligned. And that would be true. But it would also be, like all captions, approximately 1% of the actual thing. The actual thing was a nod in a corridor at 9:05. 2 seconds of a shared language no one else spoke. A woman who went still when she really listened. A man who noticed. Everything else was just everything else. By the time they reached the motorway, the sky had begun to lift. Not dramatically. Just the faint, characteristic optimism of late afternoon light finding its way through, the way it always eventually does. Not because conditions change overnight, but because light, given enough time, tends to come through anyway. Catherine watched it happen. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to.